We've been talking about this fifth cup of wine that nobody ever told us about. They always told us that there's 4 cups of wine that you're supposed to drink at the Seder. Now we've discovered that the Rambam says that you should pour yourself a 5th cup of wine and you should use it to say the Hallel HaGadol. And where did that even come from? And we said that there's a source in the Mishnah, but the problem with that source in the Mishnah is you've got one view, Rabbi Tarfon, who says that you have a 5th cup of wine, against the Chachamim, the sages, who say that you have 4 cups of wine, and usually we follow the majority. So where did this come from? What we're about to discover from what the Rambam tells us is this 5th cup of wine behaves in a very unusual way. See, everything that the Rambam writes in his Mishnah Torah, which is his book of Jewish law, he is very precise in the choice of language that he uses, so that we'll understand properly what it is that we're supposed to be doing. And when he goes through the 4 cups of wine, and I kind of touched on this last time, when he goes through the 4 cups of wine, he tells us in each of the 4 cups of wine that you say the brocha, borei peri hagafen. And that's important information because that tells you that the 4 cups of wine are essentially 4 different mitzvahs. That's why we've got a brocha on each one of the 4 cups of wine. So he says you say borei peri hagafen, and then he tells us what you're supposed to do with each of the 4 cups of wine, meaning that there's something else that you're supposed to say with each of the 4 cups of wine. The first one is Kiddush. The second one you use to read the Haggadah. That's why you only drink it after you finish reading the Haggadah. The third is for benching. And the fourth is for Hallel. So in each instance, the Rambam tells us, say the brocha, borei pri hagafen, and read X. And then he specifies, in case you didn't know that you're supposed to do this, that you drink it. 4 times. Do the brocha. This is what it's aligned with, and drink it. When it comes to this 5th cup of wine, the Rambam writes that you should pour a 5th cup of wine, and you should read this Hallel HaGadol, this chapter of Tehillim. What's it? Tehillim 136. You should read it. What's missing?
The brocha.
It doesn't say anything about the brocha. It doesn't say about borei pri hagafen. Not only that, he actually doesn't even say the obvious. He doesn't say drink it. Now, sometimes you might look at that and say, well, maybe it's a little bit of an oversight, or perhaps the Rambam relies on the fact that he's already given us this information. That's not how he works. Not saying something is as significant as saying something. So not telling us to drink it and not specifying that it has its own brocha is highly significant information. It sounds like what the Rambam is advising us is that through the course of the Seder, you drink 4 cups of wine, and then you pour a 5th cup of wine that you don't drink. Now you might think that sounds a bit odd. I mean, let's be honest. Who's going to do that? Where do we have precedent in Jewish law that you pour a glass of wine and you just have it sit on the table and you don't drink it? Like, who's ever heard of that? Have you ever heard of such a thing? Who's ever heard of such a thing? Is that likely what the Rambam is actually telling us? So the nice thing about Jewish law is you can always obviously examine and find if there is precedent. So let's have a look. Have you ever heard of a scenario in which the Torah or halacha requires you to pour a glass of wine, leave it on the table without drinking it? Have you ever encountered that? No, right? Here's an example. You ready? Here's an example. Let's say that you're having a meal on Friday afternoon. When I say a meal, that means that you've sat down to a formal meal where you have bread. And you have this meal late on Friday afternoon, which usually is not allowed because you're supposed to go into Shabbos with a little bit of appetite for the Shabbos meal. So in the late afternoon, you're not supposed to have a big, heavy meal. Why would you land up having a heavy meal on Friday afternoon?
Pesach.
Okay, Pesach is the meals at night, not in the afternoon, right?
I remember there was something.
There was something, right? There was something, and we had it just recently. What was it? If Purim falls out on a Friday. So now you have an obligation to have what's called the Su'udas Purim, to have a big, elaborate Purim meal. Ideally, you should have it in the morning for the same reason, that you don't have a heavy meal just before Shabbos. However, there is an option where you have the meal later in the afternoon, and then you have to do this complicated process, and that's why we don't advise it, which is called Poires Mapa or Mekadesh, which basically means this. You eat until Shabbos comes in, then you cover the food with some kind of a covering, You wait until the appropriate time, then you make kiddush, and then you carry on the meal. Okay? Now there's an alternative. The alternative is that what you do is, now that it's time to daven, you bench. Okay, so it's Friday afternoon. You started the meal Friday afternoon. Now it's time that it's Friday evening, so you have to bench. Let's say that you're sitting with a group of people. If you're sitting with a group of people, then when you bench, the person who leads the benching is supposed to have a cup of wine. You hold that cup of wine for the beginning. You say, Rabboisai, the invitation for everybody to participate in the benching. And then at the end of the benching, you're supposed to drink that cup of wine. You say, Hagafen, you drink that cup of wine, the person who's led the benching. Okay, so now picture the scenario. You started your meal on Friday afternoon for whatever reason. Now it's time to daven, so you bench. You have your glass of wine. But now you can't drink that wine because you have to wait till you've davened so that you can make kiddush before you drink the cup of wine. So now we have precedent for the idea of having a glass of wine that you fill, that you use to say a certain prayer, in this case the benching, but you don't drink it because you can't, because of kiddush. Now we realize that it's not so far-fetched that the Rambam could have told us that you pour a fifth cup of wine at the Seder without intending for us to drink it, but you just use it to read something, in this case, Hallel HaGadol, this large paragraph of praise to Hashem, and then you don't drink it. It's not so unusual. There is such a concept. Okay? So it sounds like that's what the Rambam advises, that you have to drink 4 cups of wine, and then you have to pour a fifth cup of wine that you don't drink. Now, if you look at it from that perspective, you can now start to appreciate something that we were a little puzzled by, which is the Rambam said that this fifth cup of wine is not obligatory like the other 4. Because we thought that was a strange way to speak, right? That he should have told us that the fifth cup of wine is not obligatory. But now we understand the context. It's obligatory to have the cup of wine at the table, but you don't drink it. So it's an obligation that is not like the other obligation of the other 4 cups of wine. It starts to fall into place. So the Rambam seems to tell us that the custom is that you pour a fifth cup of wine per head, by the way, per head. Everybody who's going to drink the 4 cups of wine pours for themselves a fifth cup of wine, and you don't drink it. You read that piece, and then I guess you decant it back into the bottle. That's what it sounds like the Rambam is saying. Now, one of the things that we mentioned yesterday was when the Rambam says yesh loi, that you should do this, is he saying that you have permission to do it? So let's say, for argument's sake, the example we used, the person who has to have a drink for whatever reason, and they need to, and you're not supposed to drink after the 4 cups of wine. So yesh loi, there is a system that you could use as long as you say this Hallel HaGadol, you're allowed to drink it. Or does yesh loi mean this is encouraged? This is what you're supposed to do. So one of the things that we said is maybe what the Rambam intends is that there's a mitzvah at the Seder to have 4 cups of wine, and then there's what we call mitzvah mina muvchar, which means an even better, upgraded way to do the mitzvah, which is to have a 5th cup of wine as well. And maybe that's what he's telling us over here, right? That the mitzvah is to have 4 cups of wine, and then mitzvah mina muvchar, even better than that, would be to have a 5th cup of wine, which it would imply that you should then drink that 5th cup. And maybe we're making this up, this idea that you just pour the cup of wine and you keep it, then you don't actually have to drink it. So again, we've got to look at precedent and understand where do we have this concept of mitzvah mina muvchar. So we're going to use an example that everybody's familiar with. It's an easy example because not only are we familiar with it, but it's a mitzvah that we all do, mina muvchar. In other words, every one of us, when we perform this particular mitzvah, we all do it at the gold standard level. What mitzvah is that? Can you think of it? Which mitzvah is it that every single Jew, regardless of how religious they are, fulfills this mitzvah at the highest level of observance? Walking into a sukkah, there's only one standard. There is no gold standard. You go into the sukkah, you're in the sukkah. There's no description of a gold standard. Here we're looking for a mitzvah where there is a specific description of a gold standard, and we all do it. In fact, I'd go so far as to say we actually do the platinum standard of this particular mitzvah, which means there's a regular standard, there's a gold standard, there's a platinum standard, and we all do the platinum. Who knows which mitzvah it is? No? Okay. So let's have a look back at the Rambam, because we're exploring the Rambam's view on halachic issues. So let's look at the Rambam, because he'll give us the language that we need in order to understand this. The Rambam tells us this. There is a mitzvah to light Chanukah lights. What's the mitzvah? The standard entry-level mitzvah for Chanukah. So he quotes the Gemara, which tells us, Ner ish ubeisoi. The entry level of the mitzvah of Chanukah is 1 candle per household per night. That's it. What's the gold standard? The gold standard is Ner lekol echad ve'echad. That all of the adults in your house, at least adult males, because a husband will naturally cover his wife's responsibility. So every adult male in the house should light their own single candle each night of Chanukah. That's considered the gold standard. That's the advanced version of how you light Chanukah candles. What do? We increase the number of candles each night of Chanukah. So every person has their own menorah, and on the first night they light a single candle, and the second night 2 candles and 3 candles, and so on and so forth. That is the absolute standard. So you've got the entry, the gold. This is the platinum standard. To not only light a candle per head, but for every person to increase the candles that they're lighting. And we all do it. Everybody, without batting an eyelid, fulfills the mitzvah at peak performance. Would you call that mitzvah mina muvchar? The expression that we're using of here. The best way to do the mitzvah. Would you call it that? The best way, of course it is. The best way to do the mitzvah, right? So there's the entry. Let's say the person was stuck on a desert island. You know those stories that everybody always brings up. And you've only got enough oil for one. Okay, fine. So you can fulfill the mitzvah by lighting 1 candle per night. But mitzvah mina muvchar, the best way to fulfill the mitzvah is every person lights a menorah that increases in number every single day. So let me ask you this. When you fulfill this mitzvah of Chanukah candles at the platinum standard, what has changed? Have you just invested more in the mitzvah? Or is the mitzvah now a different version or different level of mitzvah? You understand what I'm asking? I'll give you another perspective just to understand where I'm coming from. Let's say, it's a ridiculous example, but just to illustrate the point. Let's say that there's a mitzvah to eat cholent on Shabbos. Let's just say it was a mitzvah. Okay, maybe it's a bit of a stretch to say it's a mitzvah, but let's just say it was a mitzvah to eat cholent on Shabbos. I don't know if you ever saw a few months ago, and I actually eventually traced the original source of the message. There was somebody who sent out a WhatsApp to his community to say that there'll be cholent at shul tomorrow, and autocorrect changed it to cholesterol. So let's say that there's a mitzvah to eat cholent on Shabbos. Okay? I want to ask you, if you have an excellent cholent recipe, that's better than everybody else's cholent recipe, is the mitzvah of cholent now a higher mitzvah, or is it that I have invested more in the mitzvah? Me. I've invested. The mitzvah of cholent is the same. If you have bean cholent or you have lamb curry cholent, it's the same mitzvah. It's just a question of how much I'm investing. Okay, if you choose, for whatever reason, to light 1 candle of Chanukah, and I do the correct way, which is, or the accepted custom, which is to light the candles that increase every single night, is it that I'm more dedicated than you, or is my mitzvah a higher, better version of the mitzvah than yours? Because it's mandated, right? It's not me volunteering to do this. This is how the sages have mandated it, that they said if you want to do the platinum standard of the mitzvah, not the platinum standard of your dedication, this is the way you do it. Okay. So now, when it comes to the cups of wine, is the mitzvah to have as many cups of wine as you can have? And therefore, whoever adds more cups of wine is doing the mitzvah better? Or is the mitzvah to have 4 cups of wine, and then there's this 5th cup of wine, which seems like a little bit of an anomaly that comes into play, which is adding to the 4 cups of wine or in addition to the 4? Which one would you say? Would you say it adds to the 4 cups of wine, or it's in addition to the 4 cups of wine? In addition, right? If it's in addition to the 4 cups of wine, then you can't tell me it's mitzvah mina muvcha. You can't tell me that it's adding to the mitzvah, right? In fact, not only that, the Rambam is making it clear that it's a whole different concept. Because the Rambam's making it clear that the 4 cups of wine, you say a brocha over each cup of wine, and he reminds you have to drink it. That tells me clearly that the definition of those 4 cups of wine is a mitzvah to drink the 4 cups of wine. Whereas this one, he's just telling us, pour it. That tells you it's not an improvement on the 4 cups of wine. It's a different concept. Completely different concept. Now we've got to ask ourselves, where did this different concept come from? Why is there this 5th cup of wine? What's the point of having a 5th cup of wine at your Seder that you don't drink?
To your analogy earlier with the Hanukkah candles, so if the lighting an extra candle every night is the platinum standard, is the 5th cup of wine in some way
That's what the Rav's asking.
That's exactly the point. That's exactly the point. It behaves differently. The candles behave the same. You light them, you put them in the same menorah. It's just a question of whether there's one of them or if there's an increasing number of them. This cup of wine does not behave the same.
But you are saying that yesterday we discussed that it does become almost a better mitzvah.
No, that's the point. That's exactly the point. It's not a better mitzvah. That's exactly the point. If it were a better mitzvah, it would have to behave in the same way. You'd have to be doing the same thing again. You're not doing the same thing. You drank 4 cups of wine, and now you've just put this one on your table. That's not the same thing.
For clarity, it's not a mitzvah. We're not commanded to do that.
Doesn't matter. You're right. So it's a rabbinic law. In context of the instruction by the rabbis, which we'll call a mitzvah, is it a higher version or not? And that's what we're saying. No, this is a different story altogether. So as I mentioned yesterday, there are some people who want to suggest that this 5th cup of wine is what we call Elijah's cup. Right? And everybody would feel everybody will feel very comfortable if we can now say, this is Elijah's cup. Okay? This is the point where we say the plot thickens, because as we'll see in a moment, it's not that simple. Okay, so first of all, how did Elijah's cup get its name? Let's start with that. Most people tell you that we grew up on a diet of parents telling children, watch that glass of wine, because Eliyahu is going to come through the door, and when you're not looking, he's going to sip some of that wine. And if you're a little bit more of a creative host of the Seder, you might jiggle the cup a little bit so, the wine level goes down, and then the kids are awestruck and they say, Eliyahu was here and he drank the wine. But believe it or not, there is a suggestion that the name Elijah's cup has a very different meaning. In Gemara, anytime that the Gemara reaches a point that it cannot resolve an issue, so it raises an halachic question, it debates, discusses, and then eventually lands at a point where we don't know what you're supposed to do in practice, the Gemara will use a word, teiku, which actually means like a stalemate, even in modern Hebrew. If a sports tournament ends in a draw, they'll say teiku. It's an unresolved match. You don't know who the winner is. And they get it straight out of the Gemara. People don't realize, how much Judaism is so invested in our culture, and particularly in the Hebrew language and in Israel. Teiku, besides meaning stalemate, is also an abbreviation. It stands for Tishbi, Yetaretz, Kushias, V'iboyos. Who's Tishbi? Eliyahu. The song, how does the song go? Eliyahu HaNavi, Eliyahu HaTishbi. That's one of his nicknames, titles.
What
right?
Tishbi
is a region. So that's like a region that it comes from. No, so what does the teiku mean? Tishbi, Eliyahu, who has this name Tishbi, Yetaretz, he will answer Kushias v'iboyos, those unresolved questions that we've had throughout the whole of history. So that's one of his jobs. When Mashiach comes, Eliyahu, who's supposed to accompany and actually herald Mashiach, his job is to resolve all of these unresolved issues. Now here we have an unresolved issue, because there's a debate in the Mishnah, do you drink the 5th cup of wine or don't you? You got the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon who says you have to drink a 5th cup of wine. You have the opinion of the other sages who say you don't drink the 5th cup of wine. So what do? Sounds like the Rambam saying you pour it and don't drink it, because that way we satisfy at least the minimum requirements of both opinions. You satisfy Rabbi Tarfon who says you have to have the 5th cup of wine. You satisfy the rabbis who say you only drink 4 cups of wine. And so you got this cup kind of sitting on your table, and then there it is, And we call it the cup of Eliyahu because one day he'll come and he'll explain if you drink it or you don't have to pour it at all. That's how people understand what the fifth cup of wine, the Eliyahu's cup, is. And that's what it sounds like. There's only one problem. How many Elijah cups do you have at your Seder? You have one. You might have 100 people at your Seder, and you'll put one Elijah's cup. The Rambam is saying, in the singular, yesh loi, you, the person who is doing all the things of the Seder until this point, meaning the same person who had to eat matzah, drink 4 cups of wine, lean to the left, tell the story, eat the maror, you are supposed to pour a 5th cup of wine. Have you ever seen that? Have you ever been to a Seder where everybody pours an Elijah's cup? Never. So then, is the Rambam speaking about what we call the cup of Eliyahu?
No.
Right? Doesn't sound like it, right? Doesn't sound like it. In fact, if you go to the Shulchan Aruch, which is, of course, the final say on how you're supposed to do things, the Shulchan Aruch uses this language. This is the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. Remember that the Alter Rebbe was given the job of reworking the Shulchan Aruch to clarify things that have been ambiguous over the course of time with printing errors, etc., etc. So it's a very authoritative version of the Shulchan Aruch. The Alter Rebbe says this: you pour, listen to the language. You pour a cup, you pour a 5th cup over and above the wine that is served to the people at the Seder. That's the expression he uses. And that is called the Kois Shel Eliyahu, Elijah's cup. That's very different to what the Rambam said. The Rambam said, Yesh loi, each individual should pour a 5th cup of wine and say this Hallel Hagadol. But the Shulchan Aruch in practice, which is what we do, says you pour 1 additional cup over and above the cups of wine of all the participants in the Seder, and that is called the cup of Eliyahu, which also we don't drink. And we also have it there for the Hallel Hagadol.
When do you pour that cup?
Okay, that's a good question. There are 2 customs. The prevalent custom is you pour that cup after benching. Chabad pours that cup just before benching. Okay? But the principle is that it's a cup that will sit at your table for the Hallel Hagadol, which the Rambam was speaking about. So that's why I say the plot thickens, because now it emerges that the Rambam had a very different custom to ours. Clearly, right? Because he says that you've got to pour almost per head a 5th cup of wine that you don't drink. And we have a custom to pour only one 5th cup of wine for the entire table that we call the Kois Shel Eliyahu, the cup of Eliyahu. So technically, the Rambam calls it the Kois HaChamishis, the 5th cup, whereas we call it the cup of Eliyahu. So there's 2 differences here: how it's referred to and what you do with it. If you look further, it would sound like what the Rambam is telling us sounds like the tradition that they used to have in the time of the Gemara. So that raises a big question. What happened to that tradition? And why did it change to the way we do it now? Sounds like they used to have 1/5 cup per head. We only have 1/5 cup called the cup of Eliyahu. When did that come into tradition? When did it change? When did we lose the original tradition that they had? And the most important question is, why?